Hello and welcome to episode 49 of Just Keep Writing,
a podcast for writers, by writers, to keep you writing.
I'm Marshall.
I'm Nick.
I'm Will.
And with us this week again is Brent Lambert. What's up, man? Welcome back. How the hell are you?
Thank you. Having me back. Doing great. Happy to be here.
Yeah, man. I'm stoked about these episodes. People seem to be digging them, so we're gonna keep the trend going. Because of when we're recording this, we don't have any current convention stuff or anything to talk about. So as far as social media stuff goes, I say we just follow us on social media, rate us 5 stars and all that kind of stuff. But what do we got? Instagram, Will?
Instagram, Twitter. Yeah, and then we're going to start a TikTok in the new year of Nick dancing.
No. Okay, I'll tell you what. If the only scenario we start a TikTok is if it's only Nick and it's just him dancing.
I'm sorry.
That's the whole point.
You guys clearly haven't been on TikTok and looked up the trendingness of authors on TikTok because it's hilarious.
The first song that Nick on our official TikTok channel is Nick going to be dancing to "Milkshake" by Khalif.
Oh my god! Oh
but
god!
I'm gonna dress as Peter Griffin.
Is it okay if I want to have nothing to do with any of that?
Now, when I got your name written on my forehead.
Oh Lord. Okay.
I love Marshall.
Anyway, TikTok aside, thanks to everybody who has been listening. Big shout out to our patrons as well. So thanks to everybody who's supporting the show. We got daily writing prompts and all kinds of other stuff going on over there. So check us out. Patreon.com/justkeepwriting. So
shout out to all our new listeners.
Yes.
Who recently got to listen to me and Barbara Lund talk at Fyrecon. Not the same one as Brent, but FYRE that I just got the opportunity to teach at. It's a local one here in Utah. It was all online. So if you guys are coming here from that, thank you for joining us. Just want to give a quick shout out to you. Love teaching everyone there.
That's awesome.
Wait, I just want to roll back for a minute. They named it Fyrecon.
So I'm also kind of confused a little too because,
because I just want to be like, okay, like again, I mean, who started it, Nick? I mean, we can edit this out, but was it a bunch of white people? Because I'm tired of this shit. Okay.
This is like the 6th year this con's been in place.
I was just about to say, I feel like I've heard of it before ours. I just
It's FYRE, and it's all about fairies and fire.
It's all about fairies, and I wasn't invited.
It's in Utah. Guess how many people?
It's in Utah.
Guess how many non-white people I saw?
Oh, please. I know. There was like 0 people.
He's holding, those of you not benefiting from the video feed, he's holding one single finger.
You had to cut this out because I just taught with them. To be fair, I only saw 13 people total.
But to be fair, when this comes out too, this will be after the fact. But I'm stoked for you. I'm glad you had a good time on that. That's good.
I will be getting the recordings. So those recordings will actually be able to be put out on our site or on my author website in the coming months.
That's a good reminder too. We have the podcast one we did for WXR that I'd like to put up too at some point too. So there will be some more stuff coming to Patreon too. So, and
will you tell our dear listeners what you discussed, you and Barbara?
Yeah. So me and Barbara were able to teach a class about writing fighting scenes. This is something I really enjoy, but I don't enjoy. I like action movies, but I hate action movies that are just about blowing stuff up. So when it comes to writing fighting scenes, it's something I'm pretty particular on. We did this in our group or other writing group together, me, you, and Brian and Will. Yeah. So it's something I'm clearly passionate about. The other class we talked about was writing military and police PTSD. So that class comes with a heavy label graphic warning content. In the beginning, because we do discuss things such as dark humor, which is a very common coping mechanism in those worlds. It was super fun. It's a newer class for me to be teaching because I do deal with my own PTSD and anxiety and depression stuff. It's a little hard in the beginning, but as I teach it more, I'm getting better at it and just trying to bring awareness to that mental health side of things wherever I can.
Dude, I'm stoked for you. I didn't realize you had already taught that. I thought it was something that was upcoming. So congrats on that. That's amazing.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah,
did you guys get the picture?
And also, I got the picture, but again, so many texts. But what I was going to say also, my friend, is that you know, kind of when we talk before we start recording, I say like, oh, I'm not going to talk about conventions and stuff that's going on. And you failed to mention that at all. So,
well, you know, it is a thing where I know my place. So I keep quiet until we're recording, and then you can't shut me up.
Good point.
All right. It was actually, it skipped my mind until we said something right then and there. And I was like, oh, wait.
No, that's great. I'm stoked for you. And, you know, tell Barbara hi for me. I'm stoked you guys got to do that. So
absolutely.
All right. So let's get right into it there, team. So we are going to continue our conversation from the last episode. So if you're tuning in from part 2, this will be part 3, obviously. We're going to continue our conversation about mastering plot twists by Jane Cleland. And we're going to keep rolling through it. And so, Will, why don't you start us off? We're starting at the very end of chapter 2. And we're going to talk about, it just flew out of my head, thematic heft. Good.
Yep.
Go.
So the idea behind it is the more familiar you are with your characters' needs and wants, their longings, the stronger your stories will be. And it's by gauging how conflicts inform plots and storylines, you're able to add weight and importance to your writing. I think some of the things that you want to think about is there's 3 things. Identify a person's longing, choosing an opposing force to create conflict, and align the conflict with the prime motivator. And I'm going to go down the row. Can you guys talk about how you're utilizing that? Or like when you think about like your main protagonist or maybe your villain, like how does it help us identify a person's longing in the story?
Well, we're talking about figure 2.5 on page 51, thematic heft.
It's after that.
2.6.
Yeah.
2.6.
It's homing in the relationships between key elements. So think of it this way. When you're thinking about conflict, you can start doing it by identifying a person's longing, choose an opposing force to create a conflict, and align the conflict with the prime motivator. So my question is how do the 3 of you, have you used this? Did it make you think about your main character and how to create more conflict and maybe in areas that you were struggling in or that you can identify in your own writing or things that you've read?
You know, I think the more I go through this book, I identify weaker points in my current writing. And one of them is building that relationship between the conflict and my character's prime motivator, which for me is my character just wants to fit into society normally. But due to the conflicts, they can't do that and things like that. So I'm trying to establish that a little bit more, if that makes any sense to you guys.
No, it does.
Will's looking at me like I'm crazy, so.
Not at all.
Yeah, and my wife just said I'm crazy too, so I'm screwed.
Well, to be fair, dude, we all know you are crazy, but it's in a good way, and we love you. So I guess what I was trying to figure out with 2.6, because I struggled with this a little bit, but what I did was I kind of looked at the questions at the end of the chapter and kind of, I'm really trying to figure out a couple things with this, because this is obviously bridging from what we were talking about last time, which was the mice stuff, right? And just trying to figure out where we had a nice conversation about villains. We had a nice conversation about our current works. So essentially, this last thing is thematic heft is something I haven't really thought about, but I think it's something that if folks are listening to this and want to go back to this exercise, if they get stuck or trying to figure out if something's not working, this is a really good exercise to kind of dive into that. You know what I mean? Like, I don't necessarily have an answer to your question right now, Will, is what I'm saying. But what I am saying is I think this exercise is really important. I'm sorry I can't answer your question. Brent's going to say something.
Well, okay. So for me in my writing, I like to, especially in that pre-planning phase or that planning phase before you actually start drafting, I like to ask myself questions. So for these 3 things, it worked better for me when I reframed it as a question. So when they say identify a person's longing, I reframed it as, what does my character want? And then choose an opposing force to create a conflict, I rephrased it as, who or what is standing in their way of getting what they want? And then align the conflict with the prime motivator. Why does the character want what they want, basically? And reframing it that way as a question, for me, it works better, because that asking myself questions is is an easier way for me to like map stuff out. So that's kind of what I did with these. And I thought about, I mean, the last novel I finished was before I started reading this book, but I started thinking about some of my characters in that work, and it kind of like going into revisions, I feel like I'm going to be a little bit stronger in identifying, like, am I staying on theme with the character? Am I the scenes that they're in, are they counting? Are they working towards making that theme? Like I have this one character, so he's basically he's like a 4,000-year-old like assassin. Well, he used to be an assassin for angels or whatever, right? So he left that for once the angels left, he was kind of like without purpose, and he started becoming this like mentor to this warrior figure. And so what I kind of like had to define for myself is like, why did he choose this girl? Like, what is so important to him about this girl? And I realized as I was thinking it out, it's because he's looking for redemption, and she's his redemption. And so now when I'm going through revision, I'm going to make sure I'm looking at the interactions between them from that angle. Like, because if he's looking at her as a source of redemption, he's going to be, for instance, like he's more willing to forgive her mistakes than he is of other people, because he wants her to be his redemption. So I kind of like, I guess the way I kind of examined it is just like, I think about it as trying to figure out like what that core idea is in the person, in the character, because if you're trying to like, I guess, regurgitate your work back to somebody, you should be able to sum up a character in like a sentence. And I feel like this exercise kind of gives you the means to do that.
And also too, we spent a lot of time last time, and I know we talked before we started recording about trying to focus more on books, but I always like to go back to TV shows too. And I do appreciate Brent bringing up his current work in progress too. But I keep thinking about the example I used, I think last time, from The Expanse with the character of Gunny. The Gunny character. It's like, what does she want? And trying to figure out why she makes the decisions she makes based on what she wants. She wants Mars to be okay. She wants Mars to have an atmosphere. So she sees this end game for Mars, right? But she aligns herself with these characters, with her name just flew out of my head, but with the diplomat character, and then with the shady folks and that kind of thing. And it's really interesting to see how a character, and this goes back to our writing too, is how a character aligns themselves with people that they probably shouldn't, but that end game is in mind too. As the prime motivator is like, I want this thing, so this is the decisions I should make in order to make that happen, right? So I think that's an interesting way to look at it too.
Well, I'm bringing The Expanse into it. That specific character, you see her desire and what her end game is change. She's very heavy military. She bought into the Mars is the next great thing. And then as soon as every politician had the chance to get off of Mars, they did and went to shit. And now you're seeing and what I like about it, I'll just touch on it real quick. It's common in the military. She's looking for herself. She's having like an identity crisis, which is super unique, because I think when you take this, you see her prime motivator change, and but her conflict's still the same.
Right.
Well,
you were going to say something.
I'm going to bring it back to a book called The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab, which, if anyone hasn't read it, it's really beautifully written, and the story's amazing. So for the identify a person's longing, Addie LaRue made a deal with one of the gods that you shouldn't pray to at night, but did. And she got longevity and a long life. She got to see the world. But the caveat is that every person that she meets will forget her. So her longing is in some way to be remembered and have an effect on people. And this is where the novel establishes that very drilled down longing and creates a whole world around it. The opposing force in it is not just Addie's longing to be remembered and to have a life of meaning, but it's also with the the god or devil, whatever you want to kind of describe them as, coming to collect for her soul. And then the conflict, align the conflict with the prime motivator, it's right there. It's that she wanted this, but at the same time, she didn't want to be forgotten. And it's how is she creative in the ways to find joy and meaning with it. So I think that is a very drilled down and simplified version of the book. But I think that is some way that you can also see where this very drilled down can really elaborate into a story that creates conflict.
Should we get into chapter 3? Since I know Will's very eager to get to chapter 3. And I think, and this is one of those things that we've talked about off mic too. I think we want to try to condense some of these into more than just one episode, I think, going forward. But I think getting into a book and some of the conversations, and we're all kind of geeks too, and we like talking about this stuff. So it does get a little involved sometimes, but in the future, we may try to condense, try to do 2 chapters maybe in an episode or something like that. But for now, we're going to focus on chapter 3 and call it an episode. So Will, go ahead. What do you got?
I mean, this is just about perception, the power of perception. And I think it starts off with a quote, "There is no truth, there is only perspective." And I think if you look at the state of the world that we're in right now in November, there is a reality of what is and the reality of what someone wishes. And it affects everyone, right? Both forces affect everyone, right? You have someone who, even after voter recount, has won the election. And you have an opposing force who's in power, who refuses to concede and to admit reality that their time is gone. So how does that affect everyone? Let's think about that just from a storytelling perspective. Let's say you do in a story, in maybe a post-collaptic world, you have someone who doesn't want to get rid of power because they see themselves as the just leader that needs to just keep on going. It's going to affect everyone, whether they're for them or they're against them. So perception is a really powerful part of storytelling. So the colors of perception. There's a little section of the book that talks about the colors of perception and about how someone sees color. Did you guys read that?
Yep.
Thoughts on it?
It's I think it is very effective in making sure that you have a voice in your story and that the voice is consistent, right? Because I think we all have read books where the voice of the character is just so damn strong and it holds throughout. And I think this is part of it, is that the writer is keyed into that character's perception. Like, I just finished reading The Fires of Vengeance. So it's book 2 in Evan Winter's series. But basically, he focuses on, his main character his name is Tao. And Tao is basically an all-out warrior who wants revenge for his father's death. And that's it. Like, that is his focus. He has trained himself to do horrible things for this, in pursuit of this goal. And I think the reason those 2 books have resonated so well with people is because Evan writes that perception so well, and it colors everything. And in those brief moments where he does change the POV, it's clear that you're seeing it from someone else's perspective. Like his perception of it is like the way he communicates with people, the way that he sees the world, like the way he sees politics, like all of that is affected by his perception of, and it's all filtered through this lens of vengeance. Like, there's a point where one of his friends is like, "We can't do what you're asking because this is going to upset the political order." And he's like, "I don't give a damn. I want this man dead." And so, so I think it's, and he's so focused on his revenge, he's oblivious to the fact that this queen is falling for him. Like, he doesn't, and Evan does a really good job where, like, anyone else reading that scene understands that the queen is flirting with him, but he's so focused on his revenge. He's just like, why is she being so strange? Like, like and it's so it's. I think that is like, it gives a story voice when you have a good grasp of that person's color of perception and how they see things. Like in this section, it talks about how someone who's a loner would view the lake as serene. I think in Tao's case, he's going to view a lake as an obstacle. Like, get this damn lake out the way. It's keeping me from getting to this guy, right? Like, everything is about his revenge. So, I think that's like the most recent example I've read where perception just really, really strongly colors the book and creates a great story with it.
So, Nick, perception. How do you think perception, forms characters, and what you've written or what you've read recently, do you feel like that's a really powerful tool as a writer?
Absolutely. For me, I don't know what Will's trying to say to me off mic here, but I'm in trouble apparently. I go back to one of my favorite series now, by Philip C. Quantrill, Echoes of Fate.
I knew you were going to say that one.
This last part of the trilogy, and it even starts in the second one. In the second,
I thought it was 10 books.
9.
Okay, I'm sorry.
It's 9 books. Yes, and I bring it up because in the second trilogy, you literally see a character be brainwashed into thinking they are the answer to save the realm. By the end of that book, ta-da, they're not. And I won't tell you who is, but now it sets up for the big stage, final stage of the last 3 books of them saying, I am the best thing. I am this, I am that. It is their own perception of themselves that creates such a dynamic and diverse battle and culture fight. In my own writing, currently I'm using someone's own self-perception against them. They think they're really great at this. They think they're good at that because they just don't care what other people think. So they're not hearing any of the good feedback or being open to criticism and things like that. And so I think perception, there's a lot of ways you can play with it.
I love that you mentioned that about your character. I think that's a really interesting tool of creating a flaw in your character, of them perceiving themselves to be one way, good or bad, and then they're actually not, and it's holding them back. I think that can create a very great internal conflict that can also lead to external conflict. So I think that's genius.
Now it's my turn to harp on that and make it better.
pull it off is what I like to say.
Right?
Yeah, no, I have a couple of thoughts on this. I'll come to my work in progress in a second, but I think what Brent said is really important, because as far as I think voice and perception and character perception obviously go hand in hand. I think a really good example of this, we had an interview with Dan Wells a few episodes back, and his serial killer series, I feel like does this really, really well. And I think what he pulls off in that is the character perceives himself as a serial killer, that he's just trying to keep himself from crossing that threshold into becoming what he already sees himself as. But the world doesn't see this kid as a serial killer, right? And so as things start to happen around him, the perceptions from both angles get skewed in a way where it gets really interesting. And I really like, and I think, and he does pull it off, like Brent was saying earlier, with the character voice along with it, because it is a first person perspective POV. It's really, really well done. So that's something to keep in mind as far as a good example. I'm Not a Serial Killer series with Dan Wells, in my opinion. But as far as my current work, I have this, and I think I talked about the other POV character, the female character I have in my current work, and she's just looking for acceptance anywhere, right? But her perception of the world is skewed in that she doesn't see and I'm trying to figure out the best way to say this because, again, not pulling it off yet, but she doesn't really see the impact of her decisions on a wider level, right? Like aligning herself with nefarious folks isn't a big deal to her because she sees it as a means to an end, right? But when she ends up with the brutes, the all black military force that is basically in position to save this world, this scenario, she realizes that what she's done is actually a detriment to the wider good. And I think that's a really something that as authors we just try to make work, and I think sometimes it has to come back in revision. But again, I that's the goal in that is the perception of the character of what she sees as right, wrong, whatever, but depending on what's happening around them will ultimately change that, I guess, if I'm even saying that correctly.
You are. So I really liked that Brent brought up about having a voice and perspective, and sometimes that leads you in. So I'm just going to read a paragraph of which I think captures what Brent and Nick and Marshall were talking about, but it's not science fiction. It's called "History's All You Left Me" by Adam Silvera. I'm not going to tell you anything about the plot because I think, again, this is also a masterclass of first page, first paragraph. But this is all about perspective and truth, right? And voice. You're still alive in an alternate universe, Theo, but I live in the real world where this morning you're having an open casket funeral. I know you're out there, listening, and you should know I'm really pissed because you swore you would never die, and yet here we are. It hurts even more because this isn't the first promise you've broken. I'll break down the details of this promise again. You made it last August. Trust me when I say I'm not talking down to you as I recall this memory and many others in great detail. I'm going to stop right there. I think this is the perception of someone who is, one, really believing he's talking to someone who's passed away. Two, it captures the voice of the character. And three, it automatically sets the tone. I think by having this very conversational voice towards a character who has passed away, thinks of two things. Either this person is still grieving and hasn't admitted it, or is this an unreliable narrator? Is there anything that they can say from that first point of view that is, factual? And I think that captures in about perspective and just having a voice, because I felt like that voice comes across really strong just within that first paragraph. Thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think that does establish a voice right away, right? And it answers things for the reader without having to be explicit or expository about it. Like you can pick up on things from, and I think of this quote from, I think it was Addams Family, but it was like, what is normal for the spider is chaos for the fly. And it's like, that's totally perception, right? Because it's like,
I know that line too, and I think it is Addams Family.
Isn't it from Wednesday when she was at the camp and she's going to the girl and she was like,
I think so.
Yeah, that was hilarious.
And I think about that though, because that's totally perception, right? And I think about the not just in terms of voice, but I also think about how that plays out in how you build your worlds and what you choose to describe when you're building your world. So like, I'm just like a random example, like someone who is a royal coming to this a dirty city might know this crap in the streets, whereas somebody who's been growing up there their whole life won't even think about it. So it's like, so you choosing to mention that detail says something about the character that's the POV of or whatever. So I think that perception can be used on multiple levels to kind of really, really immerse the reader in this person's point of view and perspective.
And Will, I don't know how much jumping around you want to do, but I kind of want to jump over to the groupthink part of this real quick, which is a few pages later. And what you guys have been saying kind of made me think, and my example from my current work in progress made me think about this. But on page 76, where it says groupthink is irrational, and I think this is a really interesting kind of approach to take to not only character perception but also world building too. So it says, it's what, figure 3.6. It says an individual's perceptions derive from a mysterious amalgam of factors. We may not understand all the elements that contribute to a person's perceptions, but we do know that once they are developed, they're extremely hard to change. Something different happens, however, in groups. In groups, individuals' opinions change quickly. Social physiologist Irving Janetz labeled this phenomenon as groupthink. And this reminds me a little bit of 1984, a little bit, because it's that whole idea of this is how this society functions as a group. This is what we think. And if there's an individual or a character or a voice coming through there that is bucking the system in some way, right? I think that's really interesting to go against this idea, and depending, especially if you're writing science fiction or something too, where it's a little easier to group up folks. So for example, going back to The Expanse, which I always tend to do because it's pretty easy. The Belters think a certain way, the Martians think a certain way, and the Earthlings think a certain way. So when you are an individual in that society, or a character in that society, and you start to think differently, how does that group think about you as well? And I think that's something to think about when you're crafting characters and world building too, is, and we're seeing it in our current political climate as well. It's like, half the country thinks one way, just a little over half the country thinks a different way. And that's a really interesting kind of dynamic when you take it into your fiction, I think, as well. So,
well, I think to that point though, is that it also can appear, if we're talking like, and I think this is good for writing, that we also want to recognize that things are nuanced, right?
Mm-hmm.
So where, say, half the country sides with Trump, right? I think being liberal or someone who's democratic automatically thinks, well, everyone is evil on the other side, right? That's how you can demonize people. But I think and that's easy to do, and I understand that type of thought process. But when things are more nuanced, right? That some things are not so easy for certain groups of people, and the people that it's not easy for, and this all goes back to story,
mm-hmm.
are the people who usually can be changed through logic and deeds.
Yeah.
Because they're not so back to ideology. They're doing something maybe because it's been a tradition, maybe because they don't understand where the other side's coming from, and they're not exposed to the other side.
Right.
So I think even from a writing perspective, you can really, that's a really interesting, thought process of like, how can we create nuanced characters who are part of the bad guys or good guys, and how they could actually be swayed through certain scenarios to be another, which, in that groupthink affects perceptions. They talk about Stockholm syndrome, about the two men who entered the New York City bank, and then the hostages, after only a few hours, came together to help the robbers escape, which, reading some of the articles, I don't know if you guys have ever read the articles or actually like watched it.
I've listened to a podcast about it and stuff like that. It's a really fascinating scenario, having those folks come out of that situation, essentially fighting for their their captors. It's like, oh, well, I feel like they are right in some way, and that's an interesting way to look at it.
Well, I also wonder, when you put the view of how capitalism can dehumanize us, are they really wrong? And I think it's a tough question. Of course, kidnapping people and holding them hostage is wrong. Okay. I'm not saying that it's not, but if you look at the motivation sometimes between people who are quote unquote thieves, why are they stealing? And also, if we didn't have a capitalist system, would it actually be stealing? You know, like, is that like, how can we make different worlds when we write them, not have the constraints of what we think is morally justified or right?
Right.
Yeah. Which I think that's why I really always gravitated towards fantasy too, because I always really loved the idea, and I incorporate this in some of my fantasy works too, but the idea that there could be a guild of thieves and have that be a thing that functions just fine in a society. You know what I mean? Like, why do they steal? How are they functioning? And why are people just okay with it? And so I think that those kind of nuances, like you were saying, well, I think are really interesting when it comes to fantasy and science fiction, because there can be whole sects of people that or groups, you know what I mean, that do things outside of the law as we know it, but are perfectly acceptable and function just fine in the world building aspect that, you know, we as authors bring to it, right? Sorry, Brent, I cut you off.
No. You actually built on right what I was about to say. Yeah, like that's why I love fantasy too, especially like secondary worlds, is because you can look at these models, these social constructs, and really either manipulate them, challenge them, or subvert them. Like how you brought up thieves. Like I read this really interesting thing about how crime crime is a social construct with a specific purpose, right? Like we bring up thieves, right? So a thief robbing a bank is immediately going to be prosecuted. They're going to, well, not immediately, but they're going to immediately be jailed. They're going to, have to stand trial. They will suffer consequences. Whereas a company who steals wages is going to take years before anything happens to them. And the police aren't going to do anything about it. You literally have to go get a lawyer. You have to spend your own money. You have to hope that you can stand a chance against this company. And they've robbed way more than that person from the bank ever did. So, yeah, so it's like you can challenge that in fantasy. I think you can restructure, subvert, think about all those things.
So it reminds me of two things, a book and a movie. So City in the Middle of the Night by Charlie Jane Anders. Fantastic fantasy, but it totally flips the script on having a society. Maybe I'm using the wrong word, that is socialistic, where you're getting certain amount of money or food stamps or things like that, and everyone gets the same. And there is this rebellion that's rising, and they're doing it by stealing these food stamps and things like that. And that's the structure of the story there. Well, one of the conflicts that's going on. And so, Marshall, I like that you brought up in fantasy, like, what if there's a thieves guild? Well, what if you turn capitalism on its head? What would you get? In Charlie J. Nanner's version of it, you get a dictator that's even worse, because they went so long without anything. And Will just made a face.
I think it's because he's eating.
I know, but almost like Will was thinking and slightly disagreed with me, but hadn't said anything yet. He's definitely way more well versed in books than I am, and I just recently finished this one through Audible, and I think Will's read it like 3 times.
Yeah, it's really good. It's one of my favorites.
I loved it.
I think that's an interesting thing about capitalism, socialism, all these isms that we've created as a human population, because that also affects perception, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we have a group of people here in the U.S. or a belief system. You can pull yourself up by the bootstraps and just make anything happen. Let me say this. Yes, to an extent. Okay. Depending on a lot of different variables. And in storytelling, when you can really use that power of perception from a certain group of people who maybe are the paradigm dominant culture, and then write characters who want all of those things, but have so many obstacles and conflicts in between that stops them from getting it, and go into the part of maybe one character's perception of why that person isn't getting it, and then the actual person who's going through it and their perception. So I think those are two things that you can really play with when you look at our society here in America, or I mean the world too. There's so many layers.
Yeah.
Right.
There's this. Oh, you go ahead, Nick. Sorry.
I was going to say the movie I was going to bring up to your point, Brent, was Fun with Dick and Jane.
Yeah, that's a great.
That is the classic story of stolen wages by a corrupt CEO, and it gets flipped on his head, which someone had to do on their own. Police couldn't get involved. Lawyers had to get hired, and he didn't have any money. So if you guys need a good example of that one for Brent, right there.
Yeah. There was a book I recently finished, only a couple of days ago. Actually, it's called The Shadow Saint, and there's an interesting group think happening in terms of the main city it's about. So basically, it's the second book in this series called The Black Iron Legacy. But basically, the premise of it is that it's about this city that is trying its damnedest to maintain neutrality in basically a god war. There's three or four different powers, and they're all their gods are going to war, and they're going to war. And this city is no religion here. Don't bring your saints. Don't bring your gods. Don't bring your miracles. We're trying to be neutral. And in the second book, you start to see what happens when being too hardline about that starts to affect the city as a whole. So they have this whole thing where if you're a saint of one of these gods, you immediately get quarantined. They put you in this prison. Or if you're if you're in any way religious, they try to suppress the power of religion, because it's we don't want gods here. We don't want this war coming our way. And the second book kind of challenges this idea of is that really the right way? Is this really going to keep you neutral? The world's falling apart. You can't plug in your ears and act like you can't get involved in this war. And I think it's definitely, it makes me think of in a lot of ways, it makes me think about some of the centrists you see out here today who are can't we all just get along? There's nothing going on, And it's And it's it's we could try, but you can't ignore all of the trouble happening around you. And so, yeah, I just like the book for that. I think it does a really good job of examining what happens when you try to bury your head in the sand as a collective and ignore a problem.
I mean, if we want to bring it back to science fiction or Star Wars, the Old Republic.
Yeah.
They when someone was coming to rise to power, they stuck their head in the sand. They focused on their own selves. I mean, we're seeing it right now in our country. The thing is that there's a failure to listen to people, and when we do listen to them, we deny their experiences, right? That's not how it really is. You're over exaggerating. When you're well, this is my viewpoint and this is how I feel. And you can't argue emotions, right? You can't argue things that you literally see on tape and video. 9 times out of 10, I'm not saying people can't edit it. It also reminds me of something for perception I said on the last episode when I used, we were talking about X-Men and Martin Luther and Malcolm X. And I was white people glorified Martin Luther. And I just want to say something. They didn't at the time that he was alive. Right. It was literally 68% of white Americans thought he was awful. Mm-hmm. Right. It's the revisiting the perception of history, right? Where they said, oh, he was so wonderful and great, but Malcolm X was terrible. So I think that's also, you can have a revisionist perception, right? And a revisionist perception of what you think is how things were, or, right. To gloss it over or to fit your own values, basically. Or to escape, basically saying things are still messed up. Does that make sense? Am I making sense here?
Yeah, you are. And I think what's interesting too, to just to bring it back to worlds that we're creating too, that what you brought up, Will, I think is something that I've been dealing with quite a bit lately with other avenues of life and society. But as far as when you explain to somebody, okay, this is how I feel, this is what I've experienced, this is what's going on. And then to have them say, well, it can't be that bad. or oh, I've never seen that, so it can't be true, right? And so if we're talking about characters' perceptions, that's a really interesting dynamic to play with in fiction, especially in your world building too. Is like, are there a section of people in your society trying to be heard, for example, and a large swath trying to say that, you know, their experience, invalidate their experience in some way, right? So this is a lot. There's a lot there you can play with, and that's just one example from what we're dealing with kind of right now in our society, and taking that and superimposing it on a world that you've created. And I mean, you can do this with, you know, I mean, and fantasy does this pretty well, I think, and has done it pretty well for a long time. If you jump into, you know, D&D and Forgotten Realms kind of stuff, for example, I mean, you have the feud between elves and dwarves. Like nobody really knows where that started. We know they hate each other, but it's like, well, I can't stand elves, and this is why, and you know, and it goes back and forth. But it's almost like there, every once in a while, if you have a story where there's an elf sitting down with a dwarf and actually hearing each other, that's a whole different deal, right? And so I think that's just another way you can kind of play with perception as far as characters go in world building, for sure. So,
well, that and deeply accepting all their stereotypes and flaws and just who they are. I mean,
well, 100% there's
Gimli,
racism
right?
too happening.
Well, yeah, Legolas and Gimli, they're constantly calling out stereotypes against each other, and each character plays into their own stereotypes. Like,
right,
beautiful. So we mentioned Star Wars, right? And I just want to bring it back to a book, Interdependency by John Scalzi. There's a lot of great examples of bad things happening and people being an ostrich and tucking their heads in the sand, because it's harder to deal with the real stuff than it is not to. And that I love that series.
Yeah, Scalzi does a really good job with that, especially in that series.
Yeah, Scalzi's great. So
he's a good one.
Brent, you just tweeted about, I think, was it today? About
Black
Kate Elliott's Black Wolf.
Yes,
He does that also really well.
Yes, Black Wolf. So Kate Elliott does this so well in her world building, where like I'm reading it and I love the story, but I'm also like, oh my God, like to only be able to take a tenth of that into my writing. But so she has this situation where basically there's all of this political intrigue on multiple levels happening. And what she does so well is that every character has their own agenda. And what she does really well is that she shows how people's agendas sometimes align, and then sometimes they're completely conflicting. And then other times it's like they're conflicting in one angle and then they're aligned in another angle. And she just creates this really tangled web, but it still feels like it's completely succinct by the time you start putting all the pieces together. And it's like, whoa, this person's perceiving this, but no, this is really what's happening. So there's a king in the story. His name is Jehosh. Jehosh is basically, he's a terrible king. He's not good at it. He went up north, like was conquering shit, and I guess he thought this was a good idea, but he has 2 wives, and these 2 wives are at war with each other.
I've read the Bible. This is end badly.
Yeah, no, it doesn't end well. And the fact he has one wife who is very vicious, and she has her 2 sons, and then the other wife has 1 son. He favors the youngest son. And so the other wife is like, no, you're not going to toss my children to the side. Like, I will make sure my children are protected and they will rise to power. So she has this thing where she attacks it from 2 angles. She sends one son to become this high religious figure, and she starts having him see the religious power all through the country. And then the other son, she's having him like kind of like taking over, gaining allegiance in the military. And she did this thing where she killed her aunt, and the person who ended up taking over for her aunt basically is on her side. So now she has 3 points of power that she can take out her husband with, even though he's the king. And there's a point in the story he realizes what he's up against, and he's like, oh shit, like, like I have to get rid of this woman. But she's doing all this, and it's basically like, I guess, to kind of sum it up, she does a really good job of like figuring out how people have power over each other and how those levels of power intersect and how they conflict. And I envy her skill, and I wish I had some of it. But yeah, she's amazing at it.
I mean, she's an amazing. I feel like she's one of the most under recognized authors.
Absolutely.
People should really know about her because she is an amazing storyteller.
She should be right up there with Robert Jordan, Sanderson, and I say that with like no exaggeration. Like, she is amazing. Like, the way that she managed to build this world, like the world is so rich, and even with all the politics, like on top of it, it's like I don't know. It's like sitting down to a feast when you read one of her books. It's just like, it's so much to dig into. So yeah, she's an amazing author.
Can you give her name and her series one more time?
Yeah. So the book is called Black Wolves, and her name is Kate Elliott. And she also just dropped a book, which I'm really excited to get to. I haven't read it yet, but it's called Unconquerable Sun. And it's basically a gender-bent Alexander the Great, but in space. So yeah. So wow. I've heard great reviews. I have it. I haven't had a chance to get to it. Boom, right there. Yeah. Will's holding up the picture for the listeners. Yeah, it's great. Yeah. I'm excited.
Holding up the book for the listeners. I love it.
Yeah.
Well said, buddy. Well said.
How often do we do this?
I know, right? All right. So I'm thinking, where are we at? We're pretty good on time. So do we want to wrap this up in some way, shape, or form? Will, how are you feeling about where we're at with the chapter?
I mean, I think we can stop here. You know, I think there's some other things we can go over the next episode and then go right into the next couple chapters.
Yeah, and I think the idea is to condense a couple of these chapters and try to get through the book in the next couple episodes. I really do appreciate Brent tagging along on us, tagging along with us on this journey for sure. And I think the conversations are great. The Discord loves it. We seem to be having the feedback has been really good. So
some of the things that we go over to think about, you know, your character's longing, what they want, and then also just about the power of perception, and think about the examples we talked about, and think of some examples of what you could do in your own work, and then examples that you read, because that's what's going to also help you write better.
And I think too, bringing awareness to the content and the books, the content we consume and the books we read too, I think will help us with our writing for sure. The folks listening to this, I mean, and I know we tend to fall back on TV shows and movies, and I think we did a really good job of focusing on books this episode, by the way, gentlemen, I gotta say. But I know we do fall back on that, but I mean, that's because it's easier to consume that right now, especially with pandemics and various other things going on. But picking up books and throwing those as examples too, to help you with your writing, I think is super important. So I'm really glad we focused on books, and all the books we mentioned. If we don't list them in the show notes, keep that in mind. But they are, they're out there, and, you know, jump in our Discord too, of course. And you can always, give suggestions on other ones that fit what we're talking about. For sure.
For sure. This book has been a game changer, guys. I'm not even just talking to the three of you here. It's made me want to rewrite my entire novel.
Which you probably should anyway.
So many times. Oh, it's happening.
I'm just kidding.
This has been Just Keep Writing, a podcast for writers by writers to keep you writing. Check out our website at justkeepwriting.org. You can find links to our social media and Discord channel in the show notes, as well as any other links mentioned during the show. If you want to support the show, the best way to do that is patreon.com/justkeepwriting. Thanks for listening.
Now just keep writing.